welcome to another episode of the Burn the Ladders podcast. I have today, quite unexpectedly for me, I have today a guest that I had hoped to eventually get around to, and courtesy of Sachin McDonnell, who I can't say enough about for hooking this up. We have him here today, and that is Rolf Ohman. So basically, Rolf, probably a year ago, I came across a podcast or something that you were on, and I had recently, because of the company that I helped start, OVR Performance, we have a product, and OVR is, of course, a title sponsor of this. But we have a product, the OVR Jump, which is kind of like my baby. It's a portable ground contact laser curtain grid, essentially. And one of the features that I was really excited about as we put that together was that it made getting ground contact times very easy out in the field. And as I started experimenting with that, and talking to people about what I was doing, using it with hurdle hops and things, a few people very quickly said, "Oh, have you ever talked to Rolf?" And I had, obviously I hadn't talked to you. I didn't know a ton about you. I'd heard your name before. In my sort of history as it relates to coaching and strength and performance is very much from a sort of like strength first lens. And particularly, again, with me, I made Westside versus the World. I spent a lot of time at Westside Barbell in Columbus with Louis Simmons. And so I've sort of started everything with that perspective being on the extremes of strength training. But I myself was never a power lifter, and I was always more interested in athletics, and I love track and field, and so that's sort of, I've journeyed from that end of the spectrum, and that's sort of informed my vernacular and how I look at things. But I also come at everything from this outside perspective of my education and everything, and what the first 10 years out of college for me basically was filmmaking and storytelling. So as I got back into, because I worked on so many sports related things, got back into training, and eventually started training other people. And now I work with, in a team sports environment with mostly middle and high schoolers and a few collegiate athletes of various backgrounds. Anyways, this particular quirk to sort of my outsider view, there are a few names that people would always say, like, you need to talk to this person, or, oh, did you pick that up from over here? And that led me to listening to a lot of podcasts and things with you, and I realized what people were, why people thought that maybe I had talked to you or was more familiar with you, was a lot of what you were saying about time to peak velocity and the concept sort of stemming out from that, which at the time I knew nothing about time to peak velocity, but I looked at everything from that lens of like ground contact times and the sort of assumption of, well, your peak velocity is as you're leaving the ground. So if your ground contact time, that's giving you sort of a proxy for the same concept. So that was a concept that I was really into, just by virtue of it was a feature on this essentially toy that I had designed for myself. And that leads me here now to you. So I'll allow you to talk. So I guess I don't want to bog things down too much. If you haven't heard of Rolf, obviously you're a well-renowned, I think most people know you for sprint work. Would that probably be correct? Sprinting,
Yeah,
maybe jumping. You were a decathlete.
Yeah. A broken down one.
Yeah. So I've heard you discuss before. You've had 9 operations.
Yeah.
In your career, but so with all that said, most of what I've consumed from you has been primarily sprint and speed focused. So again, a radically different sort of viewpoint. But so many of those concepts, I always say, like, when things are true, they repeat. It doesn't really matter what the task is. Sort of physical constants are constant. But so, so I just want to, I guess, go to sort of the process by which you started to get into TPV and how that started to inform your training. And I guess if someone wants your backstory, surely we'll touch on that throughout. But if they can listen to somebody else's podcast for that, I'm just giddy to get into really a dialogue about training with you. When and where was it? What was the setting in which your focus started to shift to that time to peak velocity? Like, what was the big metrics or problems that you were trying to solve? Like, just before that, what was the state of training?
I think probably what sort of spurred me on. Well, first of all, you're going to have to excuse it. I'm in the process of moving back to Australia. I will be moving out of the house in 3 days' time. So my office is absolutely empty.
Okay.
So you're going to have this echo because there's nothing in here anymore. So you're going to have to excuse that.
I'll take it.
Yeah. Things started really sort of, because I've done a lot of education. First of all, I'm an Australian, but I have dual nationalities. And I've been living in Europe for many, many years, and now on the way back home to Australia. I was in Sweden, where I am at the moment, and I had my 4th operation. And something that was popping up and had already popped up on my 1st, my 2nd, my 3rd operation, but being a bit slow, it took a while before it sort of the message started getting thumped into my head. And that was that I had a couple of very serious injuries and I was out for 3-6 months and then rehab after that. And one of the injuries, I was out for 9 months. Now, the crazy thing was when I got back, I'd been doing rehab training for virtually 6 months after my 4th operation, which was a severed patella tendon. And what was so in your face sort of obvious was that something was going on, because virtually I came straight out of rehab training and I was throwing the javelin, which is one of my best events. And I was throwing, because I'm in Australia, we used to have feet and inches, so I can say it in feet and inches. So I was throwing about 2 feet in the jab, which is just under 70 meters. And it wasn't that far off my PB. And a few of the other events, I was sort of in the ballpark. And I just couldn't wrap my head around how the hell can I be doing these results? I've done nothing training-wise, and I was all, like everybody else, consumed by how much was I snatching, how much was I clean and jerking. And those numbers weren't anywhere near what I had done. I had done sort of like a 330 a clean and jerk, because I used to compete in weightlifting during the winter in the 82 or 90 kilo class. And I was snatching sort of 245, 250. And I was nowhere near that. But I was virtually doing the same results with very, very minimal training. Long story short, what I realized after about my 4th operation was that I was constantly in a state of neural fatigue. And it was only after each operation that my neural system was actually rested, and that it was actually firing in the sense that I did have some talent, but there's no doubt about that, because I did 7,500 in the decathlon, and I had a massive amount of operations. So yeah, I should have done 8,000 points, but that wasn't to be. But what that taught me was that what we were doing, and everybody was doing, was a volume-based. Let's see how much you can lift, and everything was based on these things. Like, for example, one of my pet things was that I was very, very good at doing was setting up 10 hurdles at about 120. So I would put blocks underneath them, and I could do double foot bounds over those like like a kangaroo. Yeah, great. It's good for the shot put. It's definitely good for the discus. It was okay for the jab. It was okay for high jump because I was a power flopper and I jumped 6'9". But it did absolutely nothing for 110 hurdle, 400 meters. And because of the way the decathlon is built up, it's all based on speed. If you're fast, you can score big points. You need to be fast, fast and explosive. So very quickly then I started to understand that everything had to do with what I was doing on the ground. So I got a hold of some people at the Institute in Stockholm, and we looked at some ground contact times. And very quickly it became evident that where I was prolific was sort of in the 180 to 250 range. And then you could go into literature, and I could look, what sort of biomechanics figures had they gotten out of different places around the world. And what was evident was that bracket was what was happening in a lot of the throwing events at the level I was. Now, if you're going to throw 20 meters in the shot, you're faster, of course, because you need to make more power in a short amount of time, because you're going to throw 20 meters instead of me throwing 15 and a half meters. And then so I started shifting things, and then I moved back to Australia in the mid 80s, and tried to make the Olympic team, which didn't work because I had another big injury, and that finished me off. But when I was home in Australia, I met Charlie Francis, and that was probably the biggest wake-up call of all, because then I'd done a whole bunch of courses around Europe. I'd been to France, I'd been to Hungary, and done my elite training certificate. I'd been to university and yada, 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 and all this. But it was all old school. And then I met Charlie Francis, and I started to think then, back in sort of, this was in 87. Was it 87? Yeah, it was before the Seoul Olympics. So they were there on a training camp, he and Ben Johnson and a few of the other Canadians. And what became evident was when I talked to Charlie, some of the things that I was thinking were spot on. Other things I was just not even on the same map. It was like I had no idea. I mean, I honestly thought at that stage, 88, 87, I was 29 years old, and I actually thought I knew some shit. It turns out I knew nothing. And that was a big wake-up call. And I think, to be honest, not everybody can handle that, because by the time you get to that age and you've done the results that I'd done, well over 7,000 in decathlon, some decent results in jab and pole vault, I jumped over 5 meters and that sort of stuff. And then to sort of, and done a lot of courses. And then you sort of realize, well, none of the courses have ever talked about this and this and this and this and this and this. And you realize, righto, back to the school bench, So I became obsessed with trying to understand what Charlie was doing and how he was sequencing things and why he was doing it in the way he was doing. And what became evident was that Charlie did things, when they trained, there's only one word for it, and that was intent. They didn't mess around. When they sprint, they sprinted. And Charlie did virtually nothing between 70 and 90%. And when I asked him, when are you guys doing your 85%, 9, 150, 3x3 by 150s? He just looked at me and he said, do you race at 85%? And I thought, no. And he goes, and then it's not sport specific. It's not event specific. You're just building up this massive big base, which is going to do you nothing, because as soon as you get out of 85%, you're going to run out of steam anyway, because you're not conditioned to run faster. And that just made so much sense. And it just sort of, yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, that's, nobody'd ever said that before. And I mean, I've been to some pretty prestigious places around in Europe with a lot of so-called smart guys, and nobody had ever said anything like that. And that, from that moment on, it was like, okay, now I understand. And then, as fate had it, I went back to Europe, and whilst in Europe, I set up a high performance gym. In the meantime, I worked with the Italian national football team. I worked in pro hockey in Sweden, and I started making a bit of a name for myself, because I get people to do things which they hadn't done before. They get fast, they get strong, and they get powerful. And it doesn't matter if they're football players, hockey players, or track and field athletes. But track and field has always been sort of my calling. That's where I, that's home. And I always wanted to get back into track and field. And then, as fate had it, an older gentleman walked into my gym one day and said, my wife trains in your gym, because I had two departments, or two sides to it. One was a commercial gym for your normal everyday gym goer, and then I had a high performance section where I was working with, at that stage, predominantly hockey players, pro hockey players. And he walked in. He said, "Look, I'm part of a university project that they've started, and because the town next to me where I lived in Sweden is the headquarters of the world leading company in industrial robotics, ABB. And they said, we want to start a new division called health robotics." And he goes, and we're trying to find some projects, some startup projects. Have you got some ideas? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. Because a few years earlier, the Swedes did a very, very big study, which was called Brakeman. And Brakeman was essentially just super maximum eccentric training, slow eccentrics, which they lowered down, and an athlete would just try to resist massive amounts of weight. So we're talking, again, pro hockey players, we're talking 300 kilos, and they'd just be trying to, they couldn't stop it, but they'd just try for 3, 5, 7 seconds, bang. They'd stop, and they'd hoist the weight back up again, and the athlete would then do another reps, and they'd do 3, 4 reps and a couple of sets. The data that came out of that was a lot of people thought it was, well, okay, yeah, but I saw things which apparently others didn't see, and that was always sort of bugging me. And then when these people came and said, look, we've got this project we want to get going, I said, right, this is what I want to do. I want to build a machine that can alter the weight eccentrically, concentrically. And the thing was that the late Professor Carmel Bosco from Italy, who's done a lot of very, very good work in looking at the filament sliding theory and so forth, and how eccentric capacity is built up and why it's built up and how you should work with it. And Bosco said that in his mind, it was impossible to build a system that could go eccentrically very, very fast and then unload in under 100 milliseconds, because you've got about 100 milliseconds before what you built up eccentrically, elastically, it'll start dispersing as heat dispersion, because of the fact that you're taking too much time to change direction. So this system needed to be very fast, and we actually got it to change direction and load in 30 milliseconds, so that was not a problem. Now, what was interesting was, with the Brakeman project, what we found was that it triggered massive amounts of growth hormone and strength capacity. These guys got immensely strong, but power went absolutely nowhere. In fact, their power output dropped, and nobody really paid attention to that. And then fast forward, Yeah, so the machine that I wanted to build was one that could eccentrically, we could have, for example, 100 kilos or 150 kilos eccentrically, and in 30 milliseconds it would deload, and we would have, for example, 60 kilos in the concentric. So we could build elasticity, build elastic energy over a fast eccentric contraction, and then release it with a much less load in the concentric. And we got that to work. And then I met Randy, and Randy, he was doing lectures in Europe and so forth, and he's big into Kaiser. And at that stage, I wasn't sort of at all on board with Kaiser because it was air, and there was no Kaiser over here at all in Europe. Well, not in Scandinavia anyway. But so we got the system to work and so forth. But if we fast forward, 2015, I was asked to do a lecture in Beijing at the Beijing Sports University, which I did. And then Randy had started working in China, and he said to me, "Look, mate, I want you to come over here and start working." And so I did that in 2016, and then I was head of a Olympic Sports Centre in Dalian for a year, and then I was transferred to the national team together with Randy, and I was there between 18 and 20. Well, I was Olympic preparation coach 21, so yeah. And then I went to Hong Kong 22, 23. Now, the interesting thing is when I met Randy, Randy started talking about something that he called DIS, Dynamic Isometric Strength. And I use a system called Muscle Lab, which you've probably heard in my podcast. And the reason why I've stuck with Muscle Lab because it has one metric that it's the king of metrics, and it's TPV. And I'll explain why it's the king of metrics. And then Randy started talking about Kaiser and what it did and so forth. And then he started talking about dynamic isometric strength. And this was something which immediately, it just pushed all the buttons, because I'd seen guys that we would get, even pro hockey players, but, athletes from different age groups and sports and so forth, and they could do things eccentrically that nobody else could do. And this was like, okay, so what is this capacity that they have? Is it genetic, purely genetic, or is it something that, they've trained? But in some cases, you could see that these athletes were of the age where, no, this is not training, so this is genetic. So the thing was, what was going on? Well, if we fast forward everything, the theory that they have been working on for, well, in Randy's case, it's probably 25 years. And in my case, early 2000, the project with the quantum started in 2004. So my thinking had already started to evolve into that. And sort of working with Randy then in 2015, 16, it just, everything just clicked. So what we now know as what Randy called DIS, and what the presumption that we've had for a long time is that there are two triggers. One is velocity, one is load. Now, remember the Brakeman project I was talking about earlier? That and powerlifters, they will trigger this system with the fact that they're doing immense loads over a long period of time, so time under tension. The other end of the spectrum is when you do things extremely fast, this system will also kick in, and the system is the filament winding theory. So what happens is there's a calcium deposit that gets wound up on the muscle, and this is what gives it the body the ability to store massive and rapidly elastic energy. So this is a protective mechanism. So it's there to protect us. If we, for example, jump down from some high height, this will kick in straight away, and it will start to work as we descend into that position, whatever we're going to try to stop. And then we can hopefully, if it's not too severe, we will, be able to do something with that energy. If it's too high, of course, you can't. There's a limit, of course, to what everybody can do. But essentially, what happens is that in the later parts of an eccentric contraction, there is no lengthening of the fibers, and we now know that myosin and actin in the sliding filament theory works like this. It's a friction, so you could virtually say it's like your Velcro on your jacket. So it grabs on and it holds, and it takes a certain amount to move it. That's the sliding filament theory. What happens with the filament winding theory is that myosin and actin, they actually lock each other. And then there's a protein called titin that acts like a bungee cord, which allows these guys to move, but they're locked, but they move because this protein is acting as the bungee cord. So you've got a lengthening of connective tissue in the sense that, nobody's really, Professor John Cronin is probably the guy that's done most of the research on this at the moment, and he was the guy that Randy and I contacted. So he started a project in South Africa to sort of unravel what was going on with our thinking. And so what we now know is that this is a protein called titin that acts like a bungee cord, and it allows for rapid storage of elastic energy. And the interesting thing is that what we've found is that it doesn't really kick in straight away. So if you, for example, we've stopped, for many, many years, we've stopped doing much more than about 4 or 5 repetitions, because when we measure with Muscle Lab, you can see that TPV, it goes, and power goes up. In the first, it's a little bit lower because you've used no elastic energy. The second and the third rep are usually the best. Fourth will drop, fifth will drop, and then it just keeps dropping. So usually we cut off at 4 or 5. And if we want to do more volume, we do more sets. Now, the interesting thing is filament winding actually doesn't start sort of kicking in the adaptation until about the rep 4, 5, 6. So you've got to do more reps. So you back off a little bit in the weight, and then you increase the velocity, and then you do a few more repetitions. So once you start hitting rep 4, 5, then all of a sudden this system kicks in, and then you watch what happens to the TPV. It just goes crazy. And some of the athletes that we've tested, what goes on is just simply remarkable. It is absolutely mind-boggling. Their TPVs will drop from 190 milliseconds, which is pretty fast with a decent amount of weight on. It'll drop to 110, which is a substantial drop. Which means that
what kind of I was going to say, what kind of for context of this story here, what kind of exercises and what kind of loads are you talking about here?
Usually with the athletes because we predominantly work with sprinters and jumpers, long jumpers and sprinters. So some of these guys, most of them aren't very big. Probably one of the biggest is actually my son, who's a football goalkeeper. He's 6'4" and weighs 205 pounds. Now, most of these guys are lifting. When we're doing this, we're doing it around about 100, 105 kilos. But now comes the interesting thing. We've been if you don't have a Kaiser, which we didn't for a while, in Beijing I had I had 5 pieces of every Kaiser that's been made. So I could run around and do just a whole bunch of testing on every machine and different types of machine, and therefore Randy and I knew straight away that this works, this one, okay, and that one works in that period, this one you can forget about. And there was, I'm not going to name any brands, but there are brands of weight equipment that for high performance sports you can just forget about it because they just don't work. There's just complete rubbish. But the interesting thing was that once we started speeding up the eccentric phase with either bands, where we would use, and probably the best way to explain this is when you're using the Kaiser rack. You can do this with the Quantum, of course, but with the Kaiser rack, for example, what you can do there is you can change the amount of air and to mass. So let's say, for example, you're going to do squats with 150 kilos. So we would put 150 kilos of mass on a bar here, and then we would put 150 kilos of resistance over here in the Kaiser rack, but 50% of it, so 75 kilos, would be air, 75 kilos in mass. Now, what does that mean? Now, a lot of people say that Kaisers don't have an eccentric phase, which is one of the comments that we get, which is just ludicrous, because Kaiser is air. The air is faster than gravity, so it's actually moving it faster than 9.8 meters squared per. So what happens is the eccentric phase absolutely just goes bonkers. It increases by 30 to 40%. And this means then that when the athlete then follows this high velocity and actually does virtually a drop squat, so they do a quarter, or usually we use quarter squats, and we call them drop squats. So we just goes boom. And we use a soft box, and a lot of people say, oh, you're bouncing. No, we're not bouncing. We're trying to stop, but you'll see that the athlete will actually hit the box, and then they'll come back out of it. But we're just using that to sort of cushion, because it is a violent turnaround. What happens then is that because of that extra speed eccentrically, it triggers the filament winding, and then you can see then on the figures that you get, bang bang, 3, 4, 5 reps, and then all of a sudden 6, 7, 8, they just go woof. And it's not uncommon that we get, with 105 kilos, we've had people that have hit 8,000 watts. But the big thing is that the acceleration that we're looking at is absolutely just crazy. We've had athletes that have hit 76 meters per second squared, which is, to give you some idea, it's virtually double what they were doing initially before the filament winding kicked in. So there is so much happening, and we still don't fully understand how this works. One of the things that we've been discussing, and we'll see what research comes up with, is that from what it looks like, the filament is actually winding up on an angle. Why does it do that? Why doesn't it align itself perpendicular? Is that because of the constraints that we're doing? If we were to slow it down, would it go this way, or does it continually go on an angle? Now, we know from other research that you're talking about pronation angles of, for example, your patellar tendon and so forth. You can change things with that, and it makes a big difference. But this is something completely different. This is chemistry at its absolute sort of core, because this is a response to the loading and the intensity that you're hitting the muscle with, and it wants to protect itself. So therefore, it's kicking in systems that would normally only sort of come about when people are in a very, very fearful situation, where we've read about where people get superhuman strength. This is the mechanism. Well, it's probably not to that extent where people are lifting cars and things like that, but it's getting in that realm. It's a protective mechanism that wants to make sure that that the integrity of the tissue that's being affected is sustained. And it allows us to do things which we've only sort of thought about before, or in the case with me and Randy, it's been the basis of how we look at things, and what we do in the gym, and why we do what we do in the gym is because the gym training is virtually there to do two things. One is it's to give us a base so that we can survive the actual activity itself. In this case, running 11, 12 meters per second, which is what the best guys in the world need to do. or jump 8.5 meters in the long jump or further. And in the long jump, of course, you've got a situation where an athlete is coming down at close to 11 meters per second, hits the board, and has got to change horizontal velocity to an angle of attack of about 26, 28 degrees, and he's got about 120 milliseconds to do that. Which means then that, and this is again, we see this lack of this capacity when long jumpers, for example, will go over a winter and they say, okay, I need to get faster. I'm not fast enough. So they go home, they do a lot of good training, and they come back the next season and they're faster, but they don't jump any further. Why? Very simple, because they have not increased eccentric capacity at that speed. So in other words, it takes them, they actually have, the amortization that they have to go through on the board is still the same as it was the previous season. So the only way to utilize more horizontal velocity, which is going to mean more eccentric force that you've got to overcome, is to increase the capacity at high velocity in the eccentric phase. So therefore, doing slow eccentrics is just going to do nothing, absolutely nothing. Going back to what I was doing, that's sort of, you're in the 120, 140, 160 zone. That's not going to do it, because if you're coming in faster, you might be moving from 130 down to 120 or from 120 down to 110. If you haven't built that capacity to handle that, then you won't get off the board. You'll actually get less of an attack angle because you simply can't utilize that velocity. So what happens then is the athletes will instinctively, they'll scrub speed to sort of get back to where they feel comfortable and where they can handle. And then you've spent 6-8 months training for something that you've achieved, but you can't use it because you've missed the whole sort of the underlying structure that needs to be there to be able to compensate or to utilize this new speed that you found. So this capacity then is vital for anybody that's doing anything off the ground, which is all sprinters and jumpers, but also athletes that are changing direction. If you've got a football player or an American football player or a hockey player, the ground contact times that they will change direction differ greatly, yes, but the capacity is still needs to be there, because what they have, which we don't have to the same extent, is that they play, for example, 3 by 20 minute halves in hockey or 2 by 45 minutes in football. So you've got fatigue. And that is one of the major reasons why so many football players have hamstring injuries and groin injuries, because they simply are not prepared to do what they do on the field for 30 games, two or 40 games in a year in football. I mean, I've got hockey players that I've worked with, here, they will play close to 100 games in a season, because the regular season is 55, and then if you go to the final here, the final is being played in Sweden now, it's the best of 7, and if let's say it goes to 4 or 5 matches, you've got a quarterfinal, a semi-final, and a final. There's 20 games. So you've got 55 plus 20, that's 75. And then, bang, if you're in the national team, well, you've got another 15 games. So there's, you're getting close to 100 games in a season. So therefore, the capacity that you needs to be, on the level of, this is how much we're going to be playing. And if you don't have that, well, there's only one outcome of that, and that is that you're going to have injuries.
To go back a ways now, as you're talking about the TPV numbers decreasing, I guess, around reps like 4, 5, 6, and yet you were training simultaneously. You're training in relatively low rep sets. What becomes that like effective range for for TPV? Like, where does it, is it a relatively short window of where those TPV numbers spike, and then they start to, fatigue sets in and they start to come back up? What kind of is that range when you're training for that?
Yeah, most of the athletes that we've seen now, that they're sort of getting a peak will start to rise at about rep 4-5, and then it'll peak at sort of maybe 7 or 8, and then it'll start to drop. It'll drop. So it spikes and then drops. Now there are exceptions to the rule, and that one of those exceptions is girls. For some reason, we have a girl, for example, in Sweden who's had a very meteoric rise to. She was 2 years ago. She was running sort of 11.7, 24 seconds. Now she's running 11.14 and 22.6. The big change has been in the last 2 years. She's following the recommendations that we instill when it comes to what she's doing in the gym. Now, the crazy thing about, I can name her, about Julia, is that her times for doing a very short drop squat, which is even shorter, we call it a knicks. It's about a 10 centimeter, very rapid. The times that she has there, nobody's even close to, and we've looked at guys like Su Bing Chung, who's the world's fastest accelerator. He's run 9.83 for 100. We've looked at long jumpers that won the world championships and that we had in our group and have jumped 8.50. They can't do it, but she can. And there's been a few other girls that are doing this. So somehow there is, whether or not, we don't know what she's got as far as what she has as far as fast twitch fiber composition. We don't know that. What is interesting, which really sort of messes up your brain, is that all of this you would expect to be driven by testosterone and growth hormone, well, especially testosterone, because growth hormone is just brute strength. So that's power lifters. And if you're going to do things fast and explosively, it's testosterone. Now, girls, of course, have different levels, and there are those who are very androgynous and have very, very big levels, high levels. But at the same time, they're still way, way below what a normal guy would have. So what's going on? Why can Julia do this when we've got no guys? And as I said, some of these guys are some of the best in the world. They're Olympic finalists, world champions. And she's only a 22.6 200-meter runner. So what the hell's going on? We don't know. And that's the crazy thing about this. And it's usually the case when you get these breakthroughs, it'll pose more questions than it actually answers. And that's the case at the moment. So Professor Cronin has got a bunch of students around the world that are doing their PhDs and so forth on the filament winding theory. And I'm sure we're going to get more and more information coming out. But the crazy thing is that the amount of build-up that you're getting with fairly light, they're not lightweights. I mean, these guys are probably capable of doing, a 3 rep at about 170 kilos without a doubt. And they're only using 100, 105 kilos. But at the same time, with 170 kilos, the eccentric phase is considerably slower. So we now, so as I said before, we now know that there are 2 triggers to this adaptation to take place, and that is velocity and load. We saw this early on where my colleague Kenneth, who was head of the Melbourne Sports Academy and who's worked with me for many years, and we've done a lot of muscle lab testing. And the reason why we use muscle lab, as I said, is because TPV, because for us, TPV is the same as ground contact time. It's an acceleration. Yeah. It's an acceleration index. And then we started messing around with a few things, and the EA index, for example, which is peak velocity divided by time to peak velocity, will show you the extent at how the athlete is getting better to utilize the eccentric concentric capacity. Usually you'll see that hockey players, for example, they have extremely low numbers of EA index. It's, you know, they're sort of in the 3 range. And then when you start training them and speeding up their eccentric and concentric, they'll climb, and, you know, they'll be up in 7, 8, 9, and so forth. Then you get somebody who is very, very elastic and explosive. They'll be up at 12, 14, 16, which is, you know, a big difference. So EA index is a metric that shows an athlete's ability to be able to utilize eccentric capacity into the concentric. And usually what we find is that if we looked at a powerlifter a bunch of years ago, well, Kenneth did, this guy had about a 340 kilo PB in the bench. And then we took a world-class discus thrower. He actually made the Olympic final in 2016. And he had a PB of about 212, and I think he managed 207.5 during this test. So they started at 20 kilos, and the aim of the operation was 3 repetitions as fast as possible. That's it. That's all you got to do. And then we just kept increasing 20, 40, 60, 80, and so forth, all the way up until they couldn't do 3 reps with whatever weight that was. Now, the startling thing was that even at his virtually his maximum, the discus thrower was able to move virtually 98% of his maximum much faster than the powerlifter could do at the same amount of weight. Yet the powerlifter, the weight there was about 60% of his maximum. So a lot of the literature that we're taught at universities today about strength and power and so forth, it's most of it is, honestly, it's 15, 20 years behind the times. They're just not with it, because we can see quite clearly that it's the way you train, and as Charlie said back in 88, 87, was intent. If you go in and I think you're going to do some power training for sprinting and jumping, and you are not trying to lift that weight as fast as you can whenever you're in the gym, you're simply not going to get things done. There's just not going to be any transfer to what you're doing out there. And that's the big difference between what Charlie does, what Randy does, what I do, and a few other people, Raina Ryder. And that is that we lift fast all year round. And it was the same with Charlie. When I asked Charlie, you know, when do you guys do your 80% 150? Oh, we don't. What? But they ran fast all year round. But people have this notion, when you say fast, they only think about is max velocity. But the thing is, we will do accelerations on Mondays, all year round, and even just after the GP, and then we'll do on Tuesday, for example, or depending if they're very, very well-conditioned athletes, they'll do it on Monday afternoon. We'll lift. But those accelerations, they might be only 20 or 30 meters, but they are maximum velocity or maximum intent. And we do a lot of work with the 1080 sprint, which is part of the parcel that I invented. That gives us the ability then to do things and to mimic what happens. For example, we can set the 1080 sprint at a high load when we start, because that's what we've got to do. We've got to overcome a high amount of the inertia. But as we accelerate, that inertia drops, and we become lighter and lighter. Therefore, we can speed up. So we do the same with the 1080 sprint. We'll set it at, let's say, 15 kilos. but we'll tell it that by the time we hit 5 meters or 6 meters, it's going to be 5 kilos. So what it does then, it ramps down the weight as you accelerate. And by the time you hit 6 meters per second, whatever you've told it, then it's 5 kilos. So we can exactly mimic exactly what transpires in an acceleration, but added weights. In other words, we are strength training when we are accelerating. And then we do
similar to. Oh, I was going to say it's similar to jumping out of a pool.
Yeah.
The further out of the pool you get, the less resistance to the water. Yeah. Or I think it was Alexiev used to pull out of water.
Yeah. Yep. So these things, you can do those accelerations all year round, because it's not max velocity. And then as we transfer things throughout the year, because there's two underlining things that we've always got that drives what we do. One is progression. So whatever we do over here, and let's say over here is the competition phase, starts over here. It might be indoors. But whatever we do here, there's got to be a transition that automatically gets us to that shape over here. So now we're ready to race. So if you pick the wrong exercises or go at it too hard or do things that where you can't progress, then that's why a lot of people run into trouble. They'll find that they're in very, very good form here, and then they lose form here because there's no progression from here to there. And there's also there has to be a transference. And one thing that Charlie was adamant about, and Randy is the same, if your strength training is, let's say, over here, and if you look at the force velocity curve, and we're trying to do things from here to here as we're getting faster and faster and getting into better and better shape, then the bigger that gap is, and there's a colleague of mine over here that put together a word, and they call it gaposis. It's a brilliant word. The bigger the gaposis, the less transference you're going to get. So wherever you are in your yearly plan, what you're doing has to transfer to where you are in that moment in time. So, for example, Randy, one of the things that Randy sort of does and has, I didn't have it to that extent. It was more sort of going by gut feel. But Randy uses a lot of technology to give us the best answers, so that we can make the best decisions based on the fact that we're using things that actually tell us, what exactly is transpiring. So Randy will have tables, for example, how fast is a guy running at this time of the year for, let's say, a flying 20 meters. Let's say he's running at 2 seconds flat, which is 10 meters per second. Okay, then we've got a table that goes from there for every event, for every distance from 30 meters to 300 meters, and then from 60% to 105%. So that when we are doing things, we then know that at this stage, the athlete is in this shape. Because what a lot of coaches do wrong is they'll only look at, okay, let's say an athlete has run 10.5 for 100, and let's say he's run 10.8 meters per second. That's what they base their figures off. Same as a lot of coaches will base their figures off 1 rep maximums. But the 1 rep maximum is usually something you do when you're in very, very good shape and you've done work to get a big 1 RM. Where is that? It could be here, it could be there, it could be, but where are you? And you've got to be able to transfer this, and you've got to be able to progress all the way down to the end of the season. So a lot of thought has gone into the way Randy thinks about how he structures things, so that we have complete tables that tell us exactly how much overspeed we can use, 102 or 105%, so we know exactly how fast that is at a given time of the year. Now, of course, if the athletes are progressing, let's say, too fast, which happens, then, we've got to make a call. Do we keep going, or do we just take it a little bit piano, because we don't want to sort of push the envelope too much, because tissue and connective tissues and so forth and tendons usually take a little bit longer time to get sort of to the same shape that a muscle belly can do. So tendons are usually a little bit behind. So therefore we need a little bit more time to make things, structurally sound. And all of these things are governed by the fact that we're using TPV, we're using ground contact times and so forth, max power, max velocity in lifts. I know Randy, for example, caused a complete meltdown of the internet or whatever, some of these sites, when he was interviewed a while back here, and he says, "Oh, we don't do any Olympic lifting," and people went absolutely bonkers.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't listen to him, because we know, for example, that the best weightlifters in the world, and we happen to be next door to them, the Chinese.
Yeah.
So we could just ask some of the guys who are working with the Chinese, okay, what's Liu and Lee and these guys who are the crazy guys in the 82.5, 77 kilos class, what's their maximum velocity when they're snatching? Oh, about 1.7 meters per second. Okay, when they're doing cleans or doing hang cleans or whatever, about 1.7, 1.6. Okay, our sprinters, they're moving about 1.2, 1.3 to 1.5 times their body weight at 2.7 meters per second in a power clean. Or in a power, we actually do power pulls as we progress. We start with power cleans, they become power pulls. So we don't actually squat down and catch the weight. There's no need to, because we're trying to just to do that, a triple extension, very, very fast. Because once we're up in max velocity, it's a very, very short movement. We don't have very much flexion in the knee or the hip. So why would we want to do an exercise that we can do over here? Why would we want to do it over here when it can't get any faster? And if it does get faster, we've got to deload it so much that it doesn't do us anything. That's the thing. It doesn't give us anything to deload.
Yeah.
So we are constantly trying to move whatever weight we've got on the bar. We try to move it as fast as we can all year round. All year round.
Mm-hmm.
And the name of the game is to get a bar moving at somewhere close to 1.5 times your body weight, which is about 100 kilos in the clean for these guys, because they weigh around 70, 75 kilos. They'll move that at 2.6, 2.7 meters per second. That is, and so that is a continuum that we're constantly working on. But of course, we do a lot of other exercises, but Olympic lifting is something that we definitely, Kenneth, at the Malmo Sports Academy, we've done a lot of work. He and I, and I've done some work with Professor Rick Howard at Western University on long-term athletic development. And there, it's a different story, because what we want to do then is to give these athletes movement. I talk about movement patterns. There are 9 different types of movement patterns that you do, and that you need to have these movement patterns, because if you don't, you will actually find, and this is something that we see very, very prevalent in places like China, where athletes are very young when they start to, for example, concentrate on long jumping. And then all of a sudden, when Randy's working with them, and we've worked with them for a couple of years, things just come to a screeching halt when it comes to technical education. Their technique, it just seems to level off. And, I asked Randy, when we discussed this, and I said, why is that? And he said, they just don't have enough movement patterns. So, and I said, how do you mean? He said, well, have a look at this and this and this guy, and ask him to do this and that exercise, and watch what happens. And so we do some exercises. It could be hinging movement. It could be a lateral movement with a hinge, with a twist and a medicine ball throw. And you can just see straight away that they're not comfortable at all. This is just like, whoa, wow. And then you realize, okay, now if I'm doing an event where you've got a rotational movement and things are happening and you're slowing down body sections and speeding up like in a rotational throw, and you've got a bunch of things that are missing over here, well, guess what? They're gonna surface once you start getting to a certain level in your throwing, because all of a sudden your physical capacity and your technical capacity are not going at the same level. One's moved away from the other, and it's usually the physical capacity, but the technical capacity is not quite catching up. And the reason is because they just lack 3, 4 of these 9 fundamental movement patterns. So, long story short, Olympic lifting has a very big place in long-term athletic development. High performance is a completely different animal, and people have got to stop treating it like, well, it's only junior training times 3 times the amount of training. And this is, for example, what traditionally happens in China. If you look at the Chinese, they do some very, very good work initially. Then they get to about 19, 20, and things start to, and then 23, 24, they just plateau. Absolutely plateau. Why? It's because they took the training that they did between about 17 to 21, 22, and when they plateau, they just double this training here, they just double it. And then, of course, most of them break down. Most of them have, for example, patellar tendonitis and other tendonitis problems in different areas, depending on what events they're in. And that's very, very common. It's interesting. I mean, you've found out about me through Sachin. Sachin, I've had a lot of discussions with, because he's trying to get his head around TPV, because he comes from a school, West Side barbell. You lift, you get strong, 3 rep maximum, 1 rep maximum, and that's it. Yeah, but that's only a very small portion of what you need if you're going to throw the discus a long way. And if you look at that, for example, at the moment, we've got a new world record holder, the Lithuanian, Alekna. Now, Mac Wilkins and Professor Ariel have done some measurements, and I got them from Randy. And what was apparent is that what Alekna does, and this is the secret, is that his hip movement through the ring, especially once he's got his both feet into the ground in the forward position and the delivery is about to come, his right hip is moving much, much, much faster than anybody in the world. That's why a guy who's not physically really big, he's strong, but what he is extremely fast, and he has very, very good acceleration capacity. His coach, Mantis, I've had a lot of discussions about, and for a couple of years now, and they're completely sold on TPV training and chasing the filament winding, because that's if you can tap into that, then you get some remarkable things happening that you can then utilize in fast dynamic sports.
So that kind of brings us back to another thing that I wanted to ask. I've wanted to ask this whole time. So with TPV, what? Because again, I sort of came to those similar manners of thought. Again, I was looking at ground contact times on hurdle hops, and I would restrict our hurdle hops based on, I would restrict our height based on ground contact time. And my basic reasoning was, okay, so the sort of popular definitions of just what is a plyometric is under 200 milliseconds. So I was like, well, I want to be at a point where even when we miss, we're still plyometric, so I said, okay, I'm going to set sort of our ceiling at 150, and I set up, initially 3 hurdles, and I put ground contact devices between 2 of them, and said, okay, if they both have screens on them, so we see down to the thousandth of a second. And this was with an 18-inch hurdle, and the hurdles were 3 feet apart, just arbitrary distances and heights. And I had my kids go through, and initially many of them had trouble just getting under that 0.2 seconds period. But after just a few runs, suddenly a bunch of them can hit 2 ground contacts back to back under 0.15. And so then I had a bunch of these devices, so we started progressing it in a number of ways. We started adding 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th hurdle. And again, it was we would add a hurdle as they could keep that their slowest ground contact was faster than 0.15. But again, that was just an arbitrary sort of time. And this is mostly at the time with baseball players. And immediately saw, okay, now when we go and run their fly 10s, trying to do max velocity work, we see that transference over. But simultaneously, I know that their actual ground contact when they're running when they're at their maximum velocity is significantly faster than 0.15. So, and we'd also progress, I started going, okay, we'll go from 3 feet between hurdles to 4 feet. If you could stay under 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. So I have a girl who broad jumps over 9 feet, who does 5 or 6 hurdles at 8-foot distances, staying down under that 0.2. And of course, if we went so far out, we'd see that they couldn't cycle over as they landed between. So it was like seeing those braking forces in their gait cycle. And then we'd go, okay, well, we'll raise it up by 3 inches if you can get through the sequence. So now you've got to create more force, but I'm not giving you any more time. And I would see rapidly within 1 or 2 sessions where a kid would go from struggling to get over, 3 18-inch hurdles under these parameters to then going over 5 30-inch hurdles. And it's like physically nothing has really happened there, but suddenly like he's learned some rhythm, some bounce, all of that. But as we take that into the weight room especially, and on we have a VBT device, and on ours we have TPV and EAI on it. Again, because I heard you talk about this stuff, and I was like, that's the same thing. Again, I have no formal education on this other than hanging around Louis Simmons for a long time, and traveling around and talking to coaches, using whether it's a documentary or a podcast, basically as that segue to get me to someone like you. But so I guess what I wanted to get was I sort of chose 0.15 kind of as an arbitrary thing. And then I started having some of my faster kids go 0.12 just to see what would happen. But it's one of the things that I think people struggle with when they talk about training just in any regards, whether you're talking about powerlifting, like yesterday or even this morning I was talking to Dave Hoff, who is the greatest multiply power lifter and has lifted more weight than any human ever. And in talking to him about whether you're talking about the force side and the slow side or the fast side, I think everyone has problems with the fact that these numbers shift and move in context to where someone is within that cycle. In the same way that a diet to lose weight, if you want to lose 10 pounds, you might use the same diet the whole time. But if you want to lose 50 pounds, that diet has to adjust to where you end up being in 25, 30, 40, in the same way that going off of the 1 rep max, as you said, you can't go off the competition max that's prepped and peaked to. You have to go off more of like a training max or a daily max, sort of understanding that your current number is like where you currently are and where you want to be are never reconciled until that meet day. So all that is to say, so when you choose whatever your parameters are for TPV, how close to the action? So with the long jump, for example, Jeremiah Davis, who won the U.S. Olympic trials, trains here. I'm in Tallahassee, Florida. His coach is Levon Sands, who was a great triple jumper. So they're locally, and I've set up and done TPV with them while they trained. And again, I was like, I don't really know what, say, you or Randy would say with this. I was just showing them, here's a way to look at the reps. How close, if 0.12 is what he's coming off the board, and I've measured him off the board, so he is in that like 0.1213 range. If that's what he's coming off the board, how far north of that do you want to get with TPV? Like, what is there sort of a like 150% of what he's hitting, 200%, or are we trying to go all the way down to that? Sort of, because in my mind, the whole purpose of loading anything is to largely to create more time to create the tension. So how do you sort of balance those two mechanisms?
Okay, yeah, good question. Well, first of all, a few things that we sort of, when I usually start and do lectures, I try to explain to people there are two formulas that you really need to wrap your head around, and that's power, force times velocity, and then force, mass times acceleration. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because that little a in the force, mass times acceleration, he depicts what the force is going to be. Now, power is force times velocity. So if the force is low, nothing's going to happen. Even if you multiply 1 by 10, it's going to be 10. But if force all of a sudden is 6 and you multiply it by 10, now it's 60. It's 6 times higher. So in other words, the absolute single most important metric that just defines everything of these two guys, and he is what I call the king of metrics, is that little a in the force, mass times acceleration. Acceleration is, he's the king of metrics. Without acceleration and dynamic sports, you're in deep shit, to put it mildly. Now, you mentioned what you do with hurdles. We do a very similar way. People sometimes freak out when they see what Randy and I do, because as the season progresses, our hurdles get lower and lower. Because going back to what I was doing, the closer I got to the season, the higher I would go with the hurdles, because it felt good and I felt really strong, but I wasn't fast. Because if I would have had measuring devices back in those days, I would have seen that my contact times probably would have been in the vicinity of 150, 160, maybe 150. But if I'm trying to run 100 meters under 11 seconds, I'm going to be down to about 100 milliseconds. So already now I've got a deficit. So I'm in trouble, which was what I could do. I was very good at accelerating, but after that it was game over. Nothing happened. There was nothing. So what we do, what we tend to do is we'll start with a hurdle. It might be, let's say, 60 centimeters, which we think is a high enough hurdle. Because once you start getting over 60 centimeter drop jumps, nobody gets off the ground fast. and it doesn't matter what they look like. They can get maybe one or two jumps, but that's it. So let's be honest. Once you start dropping from 60 centimeters and above, it's game over. Yep, at least when it comes to the sports that we're dealing with. So we then drop the hurdle height. And as you can see then, if you look at it, how an athlete is in that position virtually when they in the blocks, and then they accelerate out, and then they're in this position, and then it's just virtually that little movement in their knee and hip at max velocity. So we'll transfer virtually to what you guys we call them ankle pops, but they're called I think pogos is what most people in the US call them.
Yeah.
So we'll do ankle pogos. Bom, 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 bom. I've got a guy that a high jumper that he's in one of the videos or a couple of the videos that I've in my course that I've got online called the Resurrection of what's it called? Not the Resurgence, or what is it called? Or whatever it's called. My course about power and speed training. But Michael Kennelly from Hong Kong is on that. Now Michael can virtually do. After training with me for a year and nearly 2 years, he's been in Australia now with Matthew Horsnell, who I teamed him up with because after I left Hong Kong, he didn't want to go back to doing the same thing that he was doing before. But Michael can actually do 1 meter hurdle jumps without bending his knees. So he's standing straight up and he's jumping over 3'3" hurdles. That's how much elasticity he gets out of pogos, which is just crazy. Now, depending on what event you do, so you're gonna differ the heights depending on what event you do. But that for us, I mean, we're looking at long jump 120 milliseconds. We're looking at the best 100-meter runners. You're getting down to 80, 85 milliseconds. Now, one thing that we found out a long time ago was that if we need to build overcapacity. So let's say that we've got a long jumper that's at 120 milliseconds. That's what he's doing when he's jumping. Let's say he's an 850 jumper. Okay, so how are we going to progress? Well, we need to get him faster. So a guy like that, some of these guys like Eddie, for example, who won the world championships in the long jump, 849 long jumper. Eddie can run a flying 30, 276, 277, which is not that far off what Sue could run. But Eddie can't, of course, accelerate and put together 100 the way that Sue can. But if you've got these guys, these long jumpers that are jumping these 850 and above, they have this capacity for running at max velocity. They're very, very fast over 30 meters. Because that's what their run-up is. It's 30, 35 metres long. It might be a little bit longer. But the thing is, with Eddie, the name of the game was to bring him down towards 100, maybe 90 milliseconds. Because what we can see is that if we've got athletes that are working in a certain time frame, let's say they're working... the event is 150 milliseconds. If we condition these athletes to work at, let's say, around about 100, 120, we've got an overcapacity. Well, that overcapacity does two things. It opens up neural pathways and it makes us, and it gives us the opportunity to be able to reach newer levels the next year because we've opened up new neural pathways. So they're not going to stagnate in their development. The other thing that we get out of this, which is maybe even more important, is that we get endurance. And this is how our Charlie Francis and also Bolt's coach built with Bolt. Now, when Bolt was running, he's running about 20.2 for a 200 or 19.9 or something. And he went to his coach and he said, look, how are we going to get faster? We need to do more endurance. And his coach said, no, we need to get faster. So more top-end speed, more builds endurance. Now, I'll give you an example. I've been coaching an Australian sprinter that I took over, and he was running 10:50. He's now running 10:11, and has run 20:50 for a 200. We've done no 200 work virtually whatsoever, but we've increased his top end speed, so he's able to run about, I think his best is 11.76 meters per second, which is faster than what Sue could run. Sue didn't have a really big top end speed. He had a very, very good acceleration. But because of the fact that we built this capacity, this overcapacity, it actually transfers into the 200 because he's able to then run a little bit slower, which he will do in the first 100, but he can hold that speed for longer. Therefore, his 200 time went from, when I started coaching him, I think his best ever was 21:38, something in that vicinity. So he knocked off nearly a second. And we did no 200 work. Everybody else is doing 150s, 160s, 180s, and all this. We did nothing of that. We would virtually at 120 we were shutting down. So we were doing a lot of work at 60, 80, 100, 120 to build up his speed and his speed capacity. So a lot of times, a lot of athletes think that they've got to build endurance, but if they build a little bit more capacity, they will get endurance because of the fact that they have this overcapacity, and it's significant. It's a lot more than what people think. Like I said, you can run 20:50 without doing any special 200 meter work, and 20:50 is definitely not, it's not slow by any stretch of the imagination. Even the best athletes in the world, they maybe Bolt, when he's running his world record, he could probably jog a 20:50, but he's one in 5 million. So, but 20:50 is fast.
Yeah.
So these things, are important to think about. One thing that I've done and started doing very early, once I got my hands on Muscle Lab, which was in 1998, virtually when it came out, was that I've got a test that I do with my athletes, and that is a 20 kilo squat jump test, or we do either a squat jump, which is a little bit deeper, or we do a pogo, and we look at TPV. And we do this at different points of the year. So I know exactly what my athletes at their peak over here, and just before the nationals or before the indoor season starts, or in the middle of the indoor, when they're running very fast, what are they capable of doing? So I already then know, because one thing that we've already seen is that probably one of the things that TPV, apart from that it's an acceleration index, it is also an extremely accurate neural fatigue indicator, because the most difficult thing for the human body to do is to accelerate light objects. So therefore, if we use a 20 kilo bar, or you could use your body weight, but we use a 20 kilo bar, that guides us. So if my athletes are coming down, let's say I work with what I call accumulation intensification. So 4 weeks of accumulation, 3 weeks of accumulation, 1 week recovery. 3 weeks of intensification, 1 week of recovery. And that's a block. Or we do 2-1, 2-1, which is 6 weeks, depending a little bit where we are. Usually I do 2-1, so I'll do a 6-week block. If I'm then, for example, in, let's say, the beginning of week 2 in the intensification, and they warm up and then they do the 20 kilo bar jump, the 2 variations, and their TPV times are like way up here, then I will probably make a call. Okay, neurally, you're not recovering. So in other words, we are now stretching the envelope. So we need to just bring it all back down a notch or two, because otherwise their central nervous system won't be able to handle this last week. And that's when you get into trouble. So neural fatigue is something that we track with TPV all year round. So I know exactly where the guys are at any given time of the year by simply doing a couple of jumps with a 20 kilo bar.
So sort of by that logic, I use jumps again, I use the OVR jump, but measuring, we do a lot of dumbbell jumps, with relative to what a lot of other people do, relatively light loads, in that sort of 15 to 30% range of their maximum squat. And we'll usually only do maybe 4 to 8 of those, all done as singles, all with 30 to 60 seconds rest, and then follow that up with standing verticals, typically without the dumbbells. But I see, as we go from the dumbbell jumps to the standing verticals, taking that load away, just to sort of reinforce what you said about the most taxing thing is to accelerate a light object, in this case a lighter object, or just the human body alone. Their dumbbell jumps will be relatively consistent. They exist in a much tighter window, whether it's a good day or a bad day. Once they put the dumbbells down, because we'll have a kid hit their PB with the dumbbells and then be down several inches when they put the dumbbells down, which I explain to the kids typically as, sort of, you have different like levels of fatigue, and in much the same way, I could be sick and go in and squat or deadlift well, but if I'm at all under the weather, I have no chance of jumping well, or sprinting well, because simply my body can't organize or sequence whatever movement fast enough. If you slow me down, I could sort of turn the switches in the house on slowly and light the whole house up eventually. But if you only give me a fraction of a second to do it, if I have to break the chains of gravity and get up in the air, there's very little that I could do within that time frame if I'm not well recovered. So how much of your training, and I guess if we were to look at it to again take a when you're looking at the 100, the 200, 400, etc., where max velocity and elasticity are going to be such a huge component of it. If we were to look at just if you were training a jumper, or as you said, a thrower, but more an extremely short sprinter or jumper, where maybe those requirements a little more closely mirror a lot of field sports, and in particular the ones that are popular here, like American football. What when you're using TPV, when you're using ground contact times, how do you balance how much of that is mirroring the needs of that very short acceleration versus the faster, longer, more top end? Like, how would you sort of shift the balance of your use of those metrics in the weight room?
Well, as I
Or
said,
would you?
Well, yeah, we do. But to be honest, the primary importance is that as we know that we're speeding things up, and the athlete is getting faster and faster as we progress, we need to have a certain amount, or a narrow gaposis as possible, because we can transfer things from the gym if we are close to it. If we're too far away,
Yeah.
we simply can't do that. And we do that by, for example, using the 1080 sprint for doing assisted runs, and then overspeed, which are two different animals.
Mm-hmm.
And we do things like standing speed bounds, or speed bounds with a 5 or a 10 meter run in. again, that changes things, because now all of a sudden, if I'm doing it from standing, it's more acceleration. If I get a 10-meter run and then start bounding, then all of a sudden the contact times, they speed up dramatically. So therefore, there's always a progression, but we've got to make sure that we are within striking distance, that we can use these types of exercises to transfer from what we can attain in the gym to the track. Now, depending on where we are, always wherever we are, we've got exercises that we can then utilize to get into form to the next level and the next level. But once you start getting to, these results that these guys are running, when you start talking about people are running sort of 9.8 and faster for 100 meters, they're jumping 8.50, 8.60, 8.70 long jump. Now we're getting into, sort of a performance bracket, which it really does sort of, science is now very much an integral part of what you're doing. You just can't go out and, I think we'll do this today. That ain't going to work. It's going to work for a little while, but in the long run, you're going to just get yourself in all sorts of trouble. You need to measure. You need to understand what's happening at every phase and around, how much are you doing. It was interesting when I sort of started working with Randy, my accumulation intensification, which I do mostly, as I said, 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 week of recovery. And why do I use 2 weeks? Because I found that most athletes, no matter who they are, they really can't stay at a high enough level for more than about 2 weeks. And then usually they'll start to fatigue. If I go back to my own training, what were we doing? We're doing classical periodization, and this is a question I get a lot from a lot of people. And I'm very good friends with Carlo Buccelli, who's written several books about periodization with Tudor Bomper. And Carlo and I've discussed this. I would say that what we do classical periodization inside intensification accumulation. So it traditionally, what I couldn't get wrapped myself around was that you would do these very, very rigid blocks, maximum training, you do a transition, and now you go into speed training. So you'd be doing speed training, real speed training, 6 weeks out from competition. That was it. Now fast forward to today, we run fast virtually 10, 11 months of the year. We're either accelerating, or once we've got out of that phase, we are doing accelerations. They will sort of drop a little bit, or they'll get longer, and we'll get into an acceleration transition. And then, for example, on Thursdays, the day after a full recovery Wednesday, Thursdays is max velocity day. So therefore, we run as fast as we can on Thursdays. So accelerations on Monday, gym on Tuesday, rest on Wednesday, max velocity Thursday. End of story. And then Friday, gym, Saturday, it's tempo work. Tempo work is 60% of maximum. You do turnarounds, what we call diagonals on the football field, for example. They'll do 3 by 10, but they'll do 30, 60 meters, but they're only running at 60%. It doesn't, at 60%, it doesn't tax the central nervous system, helps flush out the system, and it actually builds a fairly good aerobic base, believe it or not. And also, we get a lot of gastroc training because of the fact that we're in that position, we're pushing. So we don't do a lot of, for example, straight leg or standing calf work, but we do a lot of seated calf work because the soleus muscle is very, very different. And that was one of the big things, for example, that we saw. And that one of these things that Randy sort of brought to my attention much more than I had anticipated was that when he started working with Sue, the first thing that he saw was that Sue, his capacity in the soleus muscle was virtually that of a 16-year-old girl. It was nothing. So in other words, he was a guy from the knee up who was very powerful, very strong, but from the knee down, there was nothing. So virtually when he smacked everything into the ground, he had to sit there and wait until everything sort of solidified and sort of stiffened up. And then with a little bit of help from moving forward in the stance with his tibia moving forward and then stretching, now things could start to move, and then he'd get off the ground. And that's why he was so very, very inconsistent. If he had a day on a good track and he was rested, which they weren't all that rested, then he could run fast. But he was only, at best, he was probably about a 10-15 guy when Randy took him over. And, we now know that he's run 983 and he's run a 60 and 629, which is just crazy. And this is a little guy who's not very big. But again, it shows that attention to details and understanding, if you're going to go Formula One racing, you don't bring a stock car. And if you're going, stock car racing, you don't bring a Formula One car. So you build your engine and, the capacity that your event demands. And you always build a little bit of overcapacity, and that's to make sure that we can progress and we can open up the neural system. Because if we don't do that, then it's going to be difficult to sort of keep improving, because we want to keep improving. It's not only a technical issue, but it's technical issues come about because of the fact that what most people lack when we test them is an intramuscular coordination at high velocity. Randy said something to me. Charlie was saying something similar, but it didn't quite. It wasn't the same wording. Randy said to me very early. He asked me, "Do you know what the major contributing factor to not being able to run fast?" Well, I said, "Yeah, well, most probably genetics." And he goes, "Well, yeah, but what specifically?" And I said, "Well, fiber composition." He said, "Nope." And I said, "Okay." And I thought a bit, and I said, "Okay." I thought, it's got to have to do with your ability to work the hamstrings at a high velocity. And he said, "Yeah, well, now you're getting close. Repositioning." So elasticity is actually the main factor that will limit speed, and that sort of got me thinking, because we've had guys here in Sweden we know because we've had them tested, they've got extremely good genetics, but they simply couldn't run faster than 10:30, 10:40. Why? Because their whole program that they were doing was not for a 100-meter runner. They were training like 400-meter runners. So therefore, their intramuscular coordination and ability to be able to reposition very, very fast was limited. So, and we see this also, and this is one of the things that we can do with the 1080 sprint. So 1080 sprint, you can do two things. You can either run assisted sprints, where then, for example, if we've got a guy who can run 11.5 meters per second, we will run more runs at 11.5 because we're going to help him through the acceleration to hit that 11.5. So he's going to use less expenditure to get there. So rather than maybe doing 6 repetitions at that peak velocity, we can do 8 or 9. So now we've increased his capacity, his training capacity, work capacity by 30%, which is massively. Overspeed is completely different. It's a completely different animal. Now we're talking about running at 102 to 105%. And what Randy and I figured out pretty quickly was that everybody breaks. You have to break, but you want to break enough for what you're trying to do in the ground. So in other words, if you're running very fast, then the break is very short because you're coming off the ground so fast. Now, if you start towing people, and why we tow people faster and faster is because we want to find out where is the elastic threshold. So we'll pull somebody at 10, 10.2, 10.4, 10.6. And what happens then is once they start getting towards the elastic threshold, they'll get caught out front. So in other words, their foot will be out here and they'll hit the ground there, and they'll get pulled over their support position. What happens with the machine then? Well, the machine can feel how much resistance there is. So it's giving you a Newton meter readout. So therefore we can then see, so we now know exactly where an athlete, where his sweet spot is. And as long as he stays within that sweet spot, that range, we can pull them faster and faster and faster. And then finally we find, okay, at 11.6 meters per second, that's it. That's the elastic threshold for this guy at the moment. And then we understand that, okay, now we can do things with overspeed. So we then need to do overspeed training like this. Overspeed works is exactly the same as lactate tolerances. If you go through the lactate level, it won't move. It won't budge a millimeter. The only thing you'll get better at, and people who say, oh, but athletes are getting better. No, they're getting better at withstanding pain, because it is painful to have the system reeking with lactic acid. But if you only go to there and hit it underneath, you can buffer it up and it'll move. Mm-hmm. Very, very simple. Speed works exactly the same way. Once you hit that elastic threshold, going faster than it, it's just going to wreak havoc, complete havoc. And that's one of the things that, unfortunately, people who have bought these types of devices are running too fast and getting into all sorts of trouble, because if you run too fast, the only thing that your system is starting to understand is that it's getting pulled over the support position. So it completely screws up all your timing and all the mechanics that you're actually generating at that velocity. So when you then start running and not being towed, it doesn't feel the same at all. So it's very, very important to understand that elastic threshold. And the thing is that we learned very quickly is elastic threshold is just like I do with the 20 kilo TPV test. It varies depending on where in the air I am. The elastic threshold will also vary because of the amount of work that you're doing and what type of work you're doing. That will also influence what sort of elasticity capacity you have at the moment. And it can differ quite dramatically. So if you then are not aware of that fact and you're not taking that into account, you're going to pull your athlete too fast. Now, if you're very unlucky, or if you're unlucky enough, you'll get injured. You'll pull a hammy, or you'll do a quad. If you are fortunate enough not to let that happen, or that happens, the other thing that will happen is that you'll get this timing because of the fact that you're being yanked over your support position. So it just feels weird for them. So there are some very, very sort of strict nuances, and these are always fluctuating. And I'll say it here, and I've said it in a lot of places that people have asked me to talk. For God's sake, if you've got tables, because everybody likes a simple table, yeah, that's great, but they're only a guideline. They're not the tablets. Excuse me for using this analogy, but they're not the 10 Commandments that from Ararat and Moses came down with. They're not edged in marble. This is something that you can actually get a rubber out and you can actually erase it, and you should. So these things fluctuate throughout the year depending on what's happening. Now, if you've got an athlete, for example, who's a university student and they're going towards major exams, then we know then that their central nervous system is going to be absolutely overloaded. And it makes no sense then to have a training schedule where all of a sudden during, major exams or going into major exams, they're going into an intensification period in their training. I mean, there's only going to be one outcome of that, and we've seen that happen so many times. They're going to get injured. The question is not if, it's how bad they're going to get injured. So therefore, you need to be able to have these quick tests that will tell you, no, look, the TPV is just way, way too high. They're neurally off the chart. what do? You just go, right, okay, it's recovery week. And recovery week for me and Randy is usually about 50%. So the week before we'll virtually cut by 50%, and that'll be the recovery week. And that's usually enough to sort of get them, to recover. But
you keep the intent high through that.
Well, again, it all depends on what's happening in front of you. To go by a strict sort of the curve doesn't look. It's not a straight line. It fluctuates. It fluctuates up and down, up and down, up and down. But the idea is to make it move this way, even though it fluctuates, but it fluctuates up. Nothing works, in a straight line. And we're dealing not with a computer program or or something like that. We're dealing with a human being, and university exams, having a fight with your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever, that messes up everything.
Right.
There are a myriad of things that affect athletes. Financial trouble, if they're not, they don't have enough support, and they're in a high performance level, but they don't have support from their federation and their club or whatever, and they're struggling financially. That's stress, and that's going to build up. And then if you then build up what we're trying to do, it's just going to be too much. So it's coaching at high performance is exactly what it is. It's high performance. And I usually say to people, have a look at a Formula One team. How many metrics, how much stuff do they measure? Oh, they measure everything. Everything. Because for them, if they can cut 0.3 of a second off one lap when they run 100 laps, they're going to win by 30 seconds. That's how close it is. So in other words, if they go to Hungaroring in Hungary, or if they're going to Silverstone, completely different tracks, completely different setups of chassis, gearbox, and so forth. So again, they're building a race car for that race, for that particular race, and it's a different car, different settings, and you prepare for that. So if the Formula One teams, think that, they need to measure virtually everything, it's amazing how much metrics they do capture. They do that for a reason. It's not because they don't have anything better to do with their money or their time. So when people say to me, well, how many metrics do you guys measure? Well, in my muscle lab, for a normal repetition, I think I get 37 metrics. I think it's because we've added a few as well in a spreadsheet. How many do we actually follow? 4. Peak velocity, time to peak velocity, average peak velocity, and usually force. And of those, to be honest, I look at peak velocity and time to peak velocity. That's 9 out of 10 times. I'll look at
how many of those metrics, because a lot of this stuff, again, as I use any of it, and granted I'm using it with a different sort of profile of athlete largely, how many of those, if you're looking at 4, how, just in general, how aware is the athlete, just for instance, whenever I'm doing any of this, when we put a tether on a bar to do VBT, if we're doing time to peak velocity, if that's the sort of primary metric, if that's the sort of the emphasis of the set, then I'm yelling that at them each set. But I might be looking at, I'd also be looking at what was the peak, so I might be checking, I think we can display three metrics that we can switch out, and then we have the fourth of just range of motion. But so if I'm looking at, say, all three, my tactic is always that I highlight one that sort of the athlete is primarily concerned with within that set, but I'm making sure that they sort of understand, you know, we say at OVR, like, you know, gamify your training. That's the video game score that they're chasing, whichever that metric that I select is. And I usually am not ambitious enough to sort of give a kid two metrics simultaneously. But how? So at that point, I guess what I'm saying is it breaks down to, just like I said with the hurdle hops, where a kid starts to display this improvement within hurdle hops, and then we can pretty predictably go over and, you know, they can run whatever fly segment, and they're going to do, you know, well relative to whatever their fatigue level is. There's how much of the training is ultimately the learning and education of the athlete versus like just the physiological, like the physical change and adaptation.
I think personally, I think they go hand in hand. You can't sort of, I mean, the athlete will mature biologically and physically. And some athletes will mature biologically a little bit earlier than some others will. You have late developers and early developers. But also psychologically, I mean, some athletes, and this is something that is very interesting when you come, if you look at some of the Asian cultures, because of what's been the policy by the governments with, for example, one-child policy. In China, for example, boys are very, very privileged, and they are virtually daddied by mum and dad from day one. Girls, not so, which was interesting because in China, I would prefer to coach girls because they are super motivated. And if they are in the national team, they will run through a brick wall 5 times a day just to be there.
I feel like that's everywhere with girls.
Well, I was about to say, it's interesting because if it's really, it's gotten that way. If you look at in other parts of the world as well, it is another level in China, which is understandable because of the way that the one-child policy has been set up.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Girls are more. Girls are more mature. I mean, a 15, 16-year-old girl is much, much more.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had guys in the national team in China that have been, 23, 24, and honestly, it's like dealing with 12-year-olds. It's ridiculous. So therefore, when you expect and you come into training and you're trying to do something, the name of the game is we want to win Olympic medals and world championship medals. That's what we're there for. That's our job. And then you turn down a training and there's a couple of guys there mucking around, and it's sort of like the level is sort of reminiscent of when you were 12 years old yourself, and you're thinking, my God, what's going on here? And you just think, okay, can I get their mindset now from here to here? Because that's where we are at the moment. So if they're sort of in their warm up and they're whatever they're doing and playing around and just horsing around, they're just so far behind and they're just so immature. Can I actually get them to this level? Which is also something that I've learned from Randy, because Randy's been there for so long and he's become very, very good at sort of winding them up, if you use that analogy, and getting them sort of mentally prepared for, this is what we're doing today, boys. But when we come in, they're over here. But the girls, they're actually, you actually have to bring them down a notch because they're ready to rock and roll, which is interesting. And that's something that I must say, it caught me a little bit unawares when I started working in China, because there is a huge difference between the boys and the girls in China. It's a massive difference. Yeah, no. So I think once again, you have to sort of look at, the fact that if you look at my son plays football, well, soccer, he's a goalkeeper. Now, when he was growing up and playing, he didn't grow very much. Well, he had a big growth spurt. Then he stopped growing, and then he started growing late in his teens. And like he's 6'4" now, 193. So he's a big lad. But because of that, there were boys who were, growing faster than he was. And also, when he had his big growth spurt, he had a lot of problems with his knees. But there was no, in his football team, there was no sort of, looking at that and saying, the fact that he's a goalkeeper, he's running, he's jumping, he's throwing himself, he's doing things that the other players are not doing. And if you've done, on top of that, then have a knee problem because of the growth spurt, you need to sort of just bring it down a notch and get him and keep him, healthy and keep his knees okay. Now, I suppose I had a little bit to do with that, but I've been very, very cautious, because one thing that I've learned very quickly is that even though you might be a parent, and in my case that I happen to know a few things about speed and power development and so forth, not everybody is prepared to listen. And soccer in Europe is one of those sports that, damn, a lot of the coaches don't like it when, dad comes over and says, well, look, there is a better way of doing this, boys. They don't like that at all. So I've sort of stayed out of his way that way, but I've tried to influence as he got older by educating him. And then he started, once he got to about 16, 17, he started asking questions to the coaches. And of course, he was asking some very mature and pertinent questions. And of course, that didn't go down too well because they couldn't answer him. So it was, we joke about it now. And, I said, well, what would have been better, me taking the brunt of their sort of displeasure, or you taking it? Because as it turned out, it probably didn't make any difference, because you were virtually saying what I was saying anyway, but I was educating him. But yeah, it's something that I see a lot because I've worked with football and hockey, and I've seen that a lot of team sports tend to be very, very arbitrary. Like they do this between the age of 12 to 14, they do this between 14 and 16, and this they do 16 to 18. And it doesn't matter what level I'm at. Like if you've got a kid who's just crazy good, then and is genetically gifted, he's more mature in both psychologically and physically, lift him up a year, and that's gonna give him more out of his training, and then you might hold him there for an extra year, but keeping him down here is not going to benefit him. Actually, it's going to deter, because he's not, in many cases, he's not going to develop as well. And also, you have things like motivation. I mean, a lot of problems, we've got, and especially with girls, a lot of very, very talented girls, they disappear at the age of 18, 19 for a myriad of reasons. And I think it reflects a little bit on also the school system. I mean, if you've got a kid who's, for example, I have a friend of mine whose kid was a mathematical genius, and he was actually correcting his high school mathematics teacher. He was way, way above him. But did he get any more difficult maths to work it? No, he was sitting there working with maths that honestly he could solve while he was sleeping. So he thought school was a complete bore. So we're putting everybody in the same box, but everybody's not the same. I mean, everybody doesn't even have the same ambition. I mean, some kids quite happy to just be out there, that running around. Mum and dad thinks it's great for them to play soccer, and they do. But where do they have any more ambition? No. But they're a very important part of the whole structure of that team and of the sport, because you need the people who are there for other reasons, because they provide a holistic approach to the sport and to the event. You can't just have, at age 12, you just can't take all the best 12-year-olds in Sweden and put them in one group and think, oh, we're going to have the best 24-year-olds in the world. It doesn't work like that. There's completely different things that are happening on that long-term athletic development. So if that makes any sense, we try to always make sure that we're optimizing each athlete at the level that they are at. And if that means that within that group, we've got athletes doing things here, we've got athletes doing things here, we've got athletes maybe doing things here, which we had, for example, in the national team. We had one year a guy came to us from one of the provinces. He ran 10:25 and he was supposed to go into the relay team. Okay, so we started looking at him, and he was very, very physically gifted for running fast. But as soon as we got him in the gym, he couldn't lift, he couldn't throw, he couldn't jump, but he could run. Now the problem there is, how do you get a guy like that to what can you do to him? Well, if we do too much, we're going to blow out his back and everything, because he was just ripping things off the floor, and his back was like, virtually, a round off. And the only way then was to bring him back so far that we could technically, start working with him technically with these lifts and jumps and everything. But at that stage, these are not enough to elicit an adaptation of his system. He's getting more coordinated, yes, but at slow velocities, because he's not able to do these events and these exercises. But physically, nothing's happening, because he's got a physiology which is so good genetically that what we're doing with him here just simply doesn't elicit any adaptation. So nothing happens. So then, the powers to be upstairs say, oh, well, this guy's not training enough. Yeah, we know that. But, the problem is, and then we explain the problem. Oh, yeah, but coach, we need him to run fast. Yeah, well, just leave us alone, go away, and we'll make sure that in September, this kid's going to run fast. But do they do that? No.
Yeah.
They're there. Oh, but he's not training enough. He's not training enough. And then you start training, and what happens? The wheels come off. And then we stand there and say, well, what did we tell you?
Yeah. That is simultaneously tragic and inspiring, that the sort of constant of people, coaches getting in the way of athletes, and systems getting in the way of athletes, and getting just sometimes good or misguided intentions getting in the way of actual achievements and progress. It's both both inspiring and soul crushing that is that's on every side of every ocean.
It's interesting. Randy and I usually say that if we're guilty of anything, and that's the two of us, is that, and it's interesting. We've never had a hamstring tear in our career, which is interesting. And usually, well, Randy says the reason is because we're probably guilty of undertraining people, and I would go with that. We tend to be a little bit more cautious, because at the end of the day, for me, it's because of my background with all the injuries I had. And it's no fun. I mean, it doesn't matter how talented you are. If you're injured, it doesn't really matter, because you're injured. You can't compete. So, the only thing that you need, to worry about, really, what should be the main driving factor is do whatever as least as you can, the least amount you can to get an adaptation and to stay healthy. That should be the primary concern. But unfortunately, we get too many, things, administrators and other people who jump in and, well, they've got to be in so or so form over here. Yeah, but okay, but that's going a bit too fast. And well, we've made a lot of investments this year. We needed to show. Yeah, but maybe you should be thinking 3 years instead of 1 year. Which is usually the case when I talk to people.
Yeah.
A lot of people that are making new refurbishments and they're spending in some cases millions of dollars. But yeah, it's great. But you're still talking about a biological entity and not a computer program or or a machine. And it takes time.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, this my phone is going to die soon, and that's the way that I give myself a hard out on things. Is I'm known to talk and drag on for a really long time, but so I was like, we'll see how far we go. Either he'll tap out or my phone will start to die. But this has been a ton of fun, as evidenced by the fact that for me, I spoke very little, which you don't know me, but like that. Normally, I'm someone who it's hard to get me to shut up, and that's because, again, even though you come from this again sort of radically different background, there's so many patterns to the things you see and the things that you said today that resonate with me, and sound so familiar to again things that I've heard from people in other sports, people in other industries. These just, again, when things are true, they repeat. The sort of tales of it change as the circumstance changes, but the underlying mechanisms, when they work, they keep on working. So yeah, I have a ton that I'm going to go back through and re-listen to this and keep hitting that rain button on the podcast app to try and figure out precisely what you said in certain spots. But again, I want to thank you for coming on.
Monday next week, I fly.
Where are you going in Australia?
Brisbane.
Where are you settling down?
On the Gold Coast.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I took a trip through Australia back in 2018, but I only went to Perth and Sydney. Always looking for an excuse to get back out there. That was I spent about 2 weeks out there, and it's
a big place.
Incredible. Yeah.
It's
like to come from the US, whenever people ask me, like, well, what was it like? And I was like, you can tell how similar Australia is to the US in so many ways. And at the same time, you could tell immediately, getting off of the plane and actually landing. I landed in Sydney, and then we flew to Perth, and then flew back. But I was like, the moment you got off the plane, it took me a couple days to kind of figure it out, and I was like, the just operational stress level among people there is, and it probably says a whole lot about the U.S. and what we're doing wrong to ourselves. But the just operational stress level was so much different.
Yeah.
And I was staying. I went out there to speak at a gym, and they put me up on the beach in, I want to say, Scarborough, just north of
Nice
Perth.
place.
Then I took a day and went out and saw. Yeah, I took a day and went out and saw the quokkas and Rottnest and
Right.
uh, yeah, and the food was incredible everywhere for being, you know, an island nation that has to import everything, and because let yourselves put the same stuff in your food, so it tastes like food. That was a nice change up. But yeah, it was like just no one was upset until I got back to the terminal, and as soon as we got to a terminal, it said, like Dallas, because that's where we flew into. You could like hear the American presence as you got close to the terminal, yelling, and like people in a beautiful place complaining about like being in a beautiful place, and the Wi-Fi wasn't working, or just all of a sudden minor gripes about the smallest things in the world. And I was suddenly like very sad to be going back to the U.S. Even though I love where I'm at, and I moved back to like my home city from Los Angeles. But definitely I will take advantage of that, and I will send follow-up questions and things your way. This was great, and I'll definitely I'll accept your offer to come back on, and we'll talk about scheduling it later.